A U.S. Army surgeon named Malcolm C. Grow was watching men die from wounds he knew could be stopped. Not from bullets, not from direct hits, from flak fragments, low-velocity shrapnel tearing through bodies. 70% of bomber crew casualties. Preventable deaths. Grow proposed a solution: body armor. The military's response was immediate: rejected. Too heavy. Too impractical. Move on. But Grow couldn't move on. Every mission brought more casualties, more young men bleeding out from wounds armor could have prevented, more funerals for deaths that didn't have to happen. So Grow made a decision that could have ended his career. He violated orders, bypassed the chain of command entirely, and contacted a British company famous for making swords, not saving lives. What happened next would change aerial warfare forever. If you want to see how one man's refusal to follow orders saved thousands of lives, subscribe now to the story that's Grow partnered with the Wilkinson Sword Company to develop something the military said was impossible: lightweight armor that actually worked. Manganese steel plates, 1% carbon, 12 to 14% manganese, backed with cotton and ballistic nylon. The M1 Flyer's vest, just 17 pounds, 6 ounces. Then Grow did something even more dangerous than defying orders. He conducted secret field tests, real crews, real missions, real data. And the results were undeniable. The vests stopped flak fragments cold. Casualties dropped dramatically. October 33, 12 months after his idea was rejected, the M1 became official defense standard equipment. Production exploded. The United States manufactured 338,780 M1 vests and 95,919 specialized M2 variants. The UK supplied another 9,600 under Lend-Lease. The numbers were staggering. Crews wearing the armor experienced 60 to 77% fewer casualties. In protected chest and organ areas, 74% of wounds were prevented entirely. Thousands of men who should have died lived. For his unauthorized innovation, Colonel Grow received the Legion of Merit in 1943 and the Distinguished Service Medal in 1944. He was right. The military was wrong. And the difference between those two positions was measured in lives saved. Acceptance came harder than innovation. When wounded bomber crews began appearing at field hospitals wearing damaged M1 vests, flak fragments visibly embedded in the steel, skepticism finally cracked. Medical officers examined the physical evidence and realized what Grow had proven in data. The armor actually worked. But getting there required overcoming something deeper than military bureaucracy: crew resistance. Pilots and gunners initially refused to wear the vests. The weight, though modest, interfered with movement in cramped bomber turrets. Bombardiers complained it restricted access to their instruments. Worse, crews doubted whether 17 pounds of steel would actually stop the fragmentation that killed their friends. The real breakthrough wasn't scientific evidence presented at command meetings. It was seeing the vests themselves, with shrapnel stopped dead in the metal, holes where death should have been certain but wasn't. One damaged vest spoke louder than 100 casualty statistics. Once crews witnessed that physical proof, demand transformed from skepticism to urgency. Pilots began requesting armor. Gunners refused to fly without it. The vest shifted from military experiment to essential survival equipment. This transformation revealed something critical about how innovation actually spreads in warfare, not through bureaucratic approval, but through observable survival. The vests proved themselves not in laboratories, but in combat, and crews recognized their value when they could hold the evidence in their hands. Production ramped up accordingly. What had been slow, experimental manufacturing became industrial priority. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's Armor Workshop, consulting on design optimization, worked alongside military arsenals to scale production. Medieval armor expertise met modern manufacturing demands. By mid-1943, supply shortages vanished. Every bomber group received enough M1 and M2 variants to equip their crews. The transition from unauthorized field tests to standardized equipment happened in months rather than years, driven by the most powerful force in warfare: soldiers who wanted to live. Inside the vests lay a principle that would reshape armor design for decades. The manganese steel plates, each roughly 2 inches square, were arranged in overlapping patterns, like medieval brigandine armor from centuries earlier. This wasn't accident. The Metropolitan Museum's armor specialists had consulted on the design specifically because 15th century brigandine had solved the same problem: maximum protection with minimum weight. Cotton backing absorbed impact shock. Ballistic nylon prevented fragments from ricocheting internally. The system worked because it distributed trauma rather than concentrating it. A single flak fragment hitting the vest wouldn't penetrate the steel, and the backing prevented the impact from transferring lethal force through the armor to the crew member beneath. The M1 design protected vital organs, chest and upper abdomen. Later variants specialized further. The M2 accommodated pilot controls, allowing stick operation without armor interference. The M3 extended coverage for waist gunners and radio operators in positions where lower abdomen wounds were common. Each variant represented accumulated battlefield experience converted into engineering refinement. This modular approach meant production didn't require complete redesign between versions. The same manganese steel supplier, the same cotton manufacturers, the same nylon sources, only the plate arrangement changed. It was efficient scaling that accelerated deployment across bomber squadrons.
But efficiency masked a deeper truth. The vests worked because they addressed the actual threat data. Military resistance had claimed armor was impractical because shells would penetrate it. Grove's observation proved otherwise. The threat wasn't armor-piercing shells, it was low-velocity fragmentation. Steel plates stopped fragments reliably. Cotton and nylon prevented secondary injury. Simple physics, deadly effective. By war's end, production had achieved unprecedented volume. The convergence of medieval armor principles, modern materials science, and industrial manufacturing created something new: protective equipment that could be mass-produced without compromising protection quality. 8th Air Force casualty figures told the story of armor's consequence. Of 115,332 total personnel, 47,483 were casualties, a 41.2% casualty rate that would have been significantly higher without the vests. The armor wasn't magical, crews still died, but the ratio shifted dramatically. Medical data compiled by the Army's Medical Operational Research Section documented the specifics. In protected chest and organ areas, 74% of wounds that would have been fatal became survivable. The data proved what Grove had suspected. Fragmentation wounds clustered around vital organs. Armor in those locations prevented death systematically. The psychological effect mattered equally. Pilots and bombardiers flying daylight missions over Germany faced overwhelming statistical odds. Many knew they wouldn't return. The M1 vest represented visible evidence that command cared about their survival. It wasn't just armor, it was symbolic reassurance during the darkest air campaign of the war. That morale boost influenced crew performance during high-stress missions. Bomber group commanders saw the practical benefit immediately. Crews wearing armor returned to base more often. Experienced pilots and bombardiers survived longer, sharing knowledge with newer crews. The institutional knowledge that kept bombing campaigns effective depended partly on crew survival rates. Armor extended that survival. The vests also changed crew behavior. With armor available, pilots accepted riskier bombing runs at lower altitudes, where flak accuracy improved, but where armor provided protection. Tactical doctrine shifted slightly toward missions that would have been unacceptable at higher casualty rates. The vests didn't just protect individual crew members, they altered strategic calculations about what risks were acceptable in daylight bombing campaigns. By 1944, armor had become so normalized that crews without vests felt vulnerable and unprepared. Supply had finally caught up with demand. Every bomber group possessed adequate inventory. The psychological shift was complete. An innovation that military leadership had rejected became the standard that crews refused to abandon. The authorization came after the armor had already proven itself in combat. Official adoption followed field success rather than preceding it. This sequence, evidence first, policy second, was unusual in military procurement, but inevitable given Grove's unauthorized approach. Military recognition eventually matched battlefield reality. By 1943, Colonel Grove's unauthorized work was undeniable. The vests were stopping flak fragments,
crews were surviving. The Legion of Merit followed that summer, acknowledging what the data confirmed. GROW's innovation had altered the calculus of bomber crew survival. The Distinguished Service Medal in 1944 represented higher institutional recognition. By then, GROW had become the first Surgeon General of the newly independent U.S. Air Force, a position that wouldn't exist without the medical innovations he'd pioneered. His rise reflected the military's eventual understanding that medical protective medicine was as strategic as any weapons system. Wilkinson Sword Company emerged from the war with expanded reputation. A manufacturer famous for swords and razors had become a precision metalworker producing specialized armor. Their historical expertise in metallurgy and Victorian-era bulletproof vests positioned them perfectly for World War II armor production. Wartime manufacturing contracts validated their technical capabilities and transformed their post-war industrial profile. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's role quietly faded from historical record, but influenced decades of subsequent armor design. Museum armor specialists' consultation on brigandine principles shaped not just World War II vests, but post-war protective equipment development. Medieval armor science proved relevant in industrial warfare and continued informing military design philosophy. GROW's most lasting impact extended beyond the war itself. He established the principle that medical research should inform combat equipment design. Casualties weren't inevitable, they were preventable through systematic analysis and innovation. That philosophy influenced military medicine across multiple generations and conflicts. The vests themselves outlasted the war. Korean war bomber crews used modified World War II-era armor. The basic manganese steel brigandine design persisted through design improvements into the 1950s. GROW's unauthorized collaboration in 1942 created a template that protected aircrews across multiple conflicts and decades. Post-war analysis revealed what field commanders had observed. Armor prevented casualties systematically. The statistical consistency across different operational theaters proved the principle wasn't tactical luck. It was physics. Fragmentation traveled in patterns. Armor disrupted those patterns. Protected positions survived at higher rates. Unprotected positions did not. Military institutions slowly incorporated GROW's lesson into doctrine. Protective equipment became standardized rather than optional. The cultural shift, from viewing armor as burden to viewing it as necessity, rippled through procurement, training, and tactical planning. What one surgeon had proven through unauthorized field tests became institutional policy.
The innovation also demonstrated something about military bureaucracy itself. The very officials who rejected GROW's initial proposal eventually recognized his success. Their resistance hadn't come from malice, but from institutional inertia. They believed existing doctrines and trusted established procurement processes. GROW proved both wrong, not through argument, but through evidence. This pattern repeated in later military innovations. When field evidence contradicted official policy and when that evidence was systematic and comprehensive, institutions eventually adapted. The armor story became template for how technological change actually happened in military organizations, not through visionary leadership alone, but through demonstrated results that commanders couldn't ignore. Bomber crews understood the vest's meaning beyond protection statistics. In a war where daylight bombing campaigns achieved strategic objectives at catastrophic cost, the armor represented something deeper: the recognition that individual lives mattered. Experienced crews, the ones who survived enough missions to rotate home or become instructors, did so partly because armor extended their survival odds. These veterans trained newer pilots and bombardiers. They shared knowledge about evasion tactics, formation flying, recognizing enemy fighters. That institutional knowledge kept bombing campaigns effective. Without armor extending their survival, that knowledge would have died with them. The vests also enabled a psychological shift in crew mentality. Early in the air war, bomber crews viewed survival as luck, a matter of being in the right formation or having the right pilot. Armor transformed that mentality. Survival became partly controllable. Equipment mattered, engineering mattered, preparation mattered. Luck remained, but it was no longer the only variable. Personal accounts from survivors consistently mentioned the vests. When flak hit, crews felt impact through armor. Many described the experience of impact followed by realization the round hadn't penetrated. Relief followed comprehension. The armor had worked. They had survived fragmentation that would have killed them without protection. One crew member's documented observation captured the shift. Seeing a vest with shrapnel embedded in the steel, holes punched partway through but not completely, represented visual proof that protection was real. That moment, holding evidence in hands, converted abstraction into certainty. The vests weren't theoretical. They prevented death. This human element, the psychological and personal dimension of wearing armor that worked, mattered as much as the casualty statistics. Crews who felt protected performed better under stress. Pilots who knew their vital organs were defended made tactical decisions with different risk calculus. The psychological effect multiplied the physical protection's benefit. Colonel Malcolm Grow died in 1965, having established the Air Force Medical Service and shaped the foundation of modern military medicine. But his most enduring contribution wasn't institutional, it was personal. Every bomber crew member who wore the M1 Flyer's vest and survived flak that would have killed them had Grow to thank. An unauthorized collar became the difference between death and homecoming. Thousands of air crews made it back to their families because one surgeon refused to accept bureaucratic rejection. The exact number who survived because of armor remains uncalculated in official records, but medical data suggests the number reached into thousands. The story contains a paradox that defines military innovation. Grow violated orders and was eventually rewarded. The military condemned his approach and eventually adopted his solution. Officials who rejected him eventually recognized him. This paradox suggests something unsettling about how institutions work. Sometimes the most important changes come from those willing to act without authorization, knowing they might face consequences. Wilkinson Sword Company transformed from blade manufacturer to precision armor producer during the war. The company survived into the post-war era as an industrial manufacturer. Their WWII armor contracts established capabilities that extended across decades. Swords became armor, and armor became industrial legacy. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's consulting role faded from public memory but influenced military design for generations. Medieval armor principles developed centuries before aircraft existed, solved modern problems in WWII aircraft protection, and continued informing protective equipment design through subsequent conflicts. History and innovation converged through institutional expertise. Grow's unauthorized path became standard military doctrine after the war. Medical research now routinely informs combat equipment design. The principle he proved, that systematic observation and innovation save lives, influenced military medicine across multiple generations. His violation became precedent. Sometimes the most consequential actions in warfare happen outside official channels, when one person recognizes a preventable tragedy and refuses to accept bureaucratic rejection. Grow's vests proved that principle across thousands of lives and decades of military history. An innovation born from defiance became doctrine born from evidence.